This is the state flag of Alaska. How elegantly simple. The Big Dipper and the North Star. What I see every morning, first thing, except for May and June, when I walk out on the road in the morning, I look at the Big Dipper and I automatically use those pointer stars to find the North Star. I love this state flag. This is awesome. The state motto, again, a little bit of production work. The state nickname, of course, is the Last Frontier. And my speech this morning will be to tell you about the trip I just took to Alaska for the last 2 weeks of July. That was why I missed our last 2 meetings. Here's the real basic overview. This is where I went from Rochester all the way up to Alaska. Those little pointers up there in Alaska, in southwestern Alaska, is the source of our trip, is the location of our trip. These are the people that I went with. 6 people, 5 guys, 1 lady. 2 of the guys were 74 years old. They had the gumption to take a long wilderness trip up in Alaska. My neighbor is 67. He invited me along on this trip. And the gentleman in orange is my neighbor's nephew. His name is Lee. He and his fiancee, Laura, are 40 years old, and they're about to get married next month. So all of us old guys during the trip dispensed a lot of marriage advice to this young couple. They also brought along their own personal supply of marijuana, which I think helped them get through those counseling sessions. To tell you about the rest of the trip, I'm going to take the time-honored Toastmasters tradition of saying what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. What I saw on the trip was 120 miles of Alaska, specifically of a couple rivers in Alaska. We flew in to the top of this route by float plane up to Nishlik Lake. We paddled down the Tikchik River to Tikchik Lake down in the center of things. And then we took the Nuyakuk River down to a little village of about 10 people called Koliganik, where we caught another plane to fly out. Took us 10 days to make this route. Now, how did we paddle down this river? Not with canoes like I usually do. No, we used pack rafts. Pack rafts are something fairly new to the concept of wilderness trips. They look like something you would use in your pool, but they're fairly durable. They're about 10 feet long, and they hold only 2 people. There's really no room inside the raft. All of your gear goes inside the tubes. The pack raft deflates. There's an airtight zipper back here. When we open that up, we shove all of our gear inside the tubes, and then we inflate it using an inflation bag. And the bag is just an empty nylon bag. You trap some air in it, you twist off the top, and you squeeze it down into the raft. It takes less than 5 minutes to blow up these rafts. You have to top it off with your lung power. But being a Toastmaster, that's not a problem for me. What I saw was also thousands of sockeye salmon. The sockeye were swimming way upstream. We started at the end of their spawning run. So we saw these bright red and orange salmon everywhere when we got into the river system. And it made my trip to stand in the water fishing and have hundreds of salmon around me and salmon bumping into my legs and swimming between my legs, just peacefully completing their route. Now, salmon, of course, go upstream to spawn and then they die. So as we're going downstream, we also saw many, many dead salmon. Dead salmon also attract our friends. Now, this is not an actual photo. This is not my photo from the trip because that would have been way too close. Whenever we saw a bear, we right away said, "Hey bear, hey bear," and the bear would amble off into the woods. If we had taken pictures of those bears, it would look something like this, which I call find the bear pictures. That would be where the bear would be. Again, none of these were all that close. Our bear encounters were fairly distant and fairly brief. The closest one was while I was making coffee one morning in camp, and there was a grizzly about 100 yards from camp walking downstream on our side of the river. And I said, hey bear. And he looked at me like, yeah, and walked into the woods. But nobody spent a lot of time on latrine calls that day. Whenever we would take a call of nature, we'd have to walk up to the woods and say, hey bear, coming in, hey bear. Got into the habit of doing that. But just because we didn't see a lot of bears doesn't mean they weren't around. Everywhere we were, there was evidence of bears. This was 5 feet from my tent. We pitched our tent next to this. It didn't happen after I was there. But this is a grizzly print complete with claw marks, and we saw these everywhere. They were eating all those dead salmon. So whenever we got to camp, my first job was to get rid of all of the carcasses of salmon so that we wouldn't attract more bears. Again, other things that, even though we didn't see them, we would hear everybody yelling, hey bear. Other things that I heard on the trip were things like waterfalls. We camped below this waterfall for 2 days, and the white noise was wonderful. It was just a roar. It just kind of filled the whole environment. It made sleeping wonderful. Except we also had our tent about 5 feet from the river, and we could hear sockeye splashing right next to us all night long. And every time one of them splashed, all of us admitted, we all woke up and thought, bear. But it was just sockeye. The other thing I heard was a lot of birds. The picture of the nest is actually a photo that I took on the trip. The other two are not. But I found this little nest of marble-sized plover eggs. Plovers are shorebirds like snipes. They were everywhere, and there's a little peeping going on as they're doing this. But I just stumbled on this while I was out fishing one day and was attracted by the positioning of it with the flowers and such. It was just a beautiful thing. The other type of bird I heard a lot of was terns on the upper right corner here. These terns were flying everywhere, and they were shrieking at us a little bit. Now, Lee and Laura, with their private stash of weed, put out little samples for these terns around camp, and they attracted them to camp to eat these little samples of marijuana. Yes, they left no terns unstoned. Okay, I made that up, but I couldn't resist. We also saw many ospreys and their nests, but the ospreys didn't shriek like you would think of a bird of a prey. We saw them catch many fish and things, but they cheep like my little chickens back home. So it made me a little homesick for my chickens. The other thing I heard, unfortunately, were planes in the middle of wilderness, but we heard a lot of float planes taking other fishermen out to different parts of the wilderness to go fishing. So we'd be canoeing or paddling down the river, and we would hear a plane go over someplace. But that's also how we got into where our route started. This is the float plane that we took and the lake where they dropped us off. And you'll notice that in the picture when we're starting, even before getting in the plane, we're all wearing our waders because the plane had no dock or no landing to go to and had to just dump us out into the water when we got there. So we wore our waders pretty much 24 hours a day if we were outside the tent at all, because we were always in and out of the river. And this little plane is the plane that picked us up at the end, prop job with wheels. But it was like catching an Uber with a really crazy driver. This guy drove it like it was a beat up old pickup out on a country road. He just, and we took. He came in, picked us up, and took off in less than 10 minutes. It was just no process at all. It was an absolute ball. What I felt up in Alaska was being very small in a very big space. There are always mountains looming in the background, and there's just wide open nothingness everywhere. It was a wonderful feeling. This is looking west over Tikchik Lake. This is also looking west over Tikchik Lake. I just couldn't decide which photo to put in here. So I loved them both so much. And this is also late at night. It stayed light until 2 in the morning. And then we had a brief 1 hour period of semi-darkness and it started up light again. So it really never got dark. I never had to turn on my headlamp to read in the tent, even at midnight. The other thing I felt was stretching in my muscles every morning as Laura, the physical therapist, took us through our morning paddling yoga. And it really did help us to kind of warm up for the work that we were going to do that day. And one morning, while we were doing our paddling yoga, a jet boat came roaring up the river behind us out in this pristine wilderness. And it kind of annoyed us. So Laura took us through that famous yoga move, the flying bird. I also felt fish at the end of my fly rod. We didn't get to fish as much as I wanted to and what we expected because we were traveling so much. It just took us so much longer to actually cover the distance. But I was able to catch grayling and rainbow trout and sockeye salmon. And I asked my friend Jim to take a picture of my fish. This is the actual picture he took. Normally, when you take a picture of the fish, I would expect to be in the picture. This is what I saw, heard, and felt on my trip to Alaska. Now I'm home. I appreciate my soft bed, my hot water faucet, and the absence of grizzlies. And my wife has to remind me that when we go into highway rest stops, I don't have to say, "Hey, bear!" Would I go back? Have I mentioned how much I'd like this state flag? It's a nice place to visit, but I'd really like to live there. Madam Toastmaster.